Hear you. I'm good.
All right. Okay, let's see. Hello, everybody. All right, looks like we have a pretty small group tonight, but that just means you get more questions answered. That's all. We'll show those people
Yeah, that's right.
who weren't. Oh no, okay. Actually, it's actually larger than I thought. All right, but even still, um, I'm glad you're all able to sign up, and I'm sorry about the mix-up. I'm sure you all opened the second email. Um, so, welcome to Jeff Herbener, and welcome to all you folks to our session tonight. And remember, we use the chat window to submit the questions, and there is a little question function. You can click on it, and that sets aside your comment as a question, and then we know to identify it that way. That makes it easier for me as the one posing the questions. So, all right, you can start asking immediately. All right, immediately. Let me get a pen for a second here. I just remembered I got to do something after this is over. All right. So, looks like we are just about. Looks like somebody's about to ask you a question, Jeff. Can you see the chat window?
I uh I think so. It just has the HTTP, right?
Um,
No, that's not it.
no, no. On your screen, like to the right of where you see yourself,
Uh-huh.
there are a bunch of icons. There's a gear. There's like a voice
Right.
bubble with three dots. Click on the voice bubble with three dots,
Okay.
and then
Yeah,
you see
I
the
got it
name.
now.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we're all waiting on Jose. All right, 'cause it looks like he's
I
starting.
see. Yeah.
Then he wasn't sure of himself.
There we
Oh,
go.
here he goes. All right, all right, there he is. He says, "I will be attending grad school at GMU, that's George Mason University, and will be forced to take mathematical economics. Do you think mathematical economics is useful in Austrian economics?"
Ooh, boy. Mathematical economics is, of course, useful for describing equilibrium states. So it isn't completely worthless. In Austrian economics, we do have equilibrium constructs, and they could be described in this fashion. Um, there are certain sort of arithmetic equations that are not vacuous and that are used in Austrian economics in a kind of standard way. We think about accounting um, formulas and so on. So I wouldn't say it's entirely useless, but it doesn't, of course, form any kind of fundamental system of analysis, or we don't base theory on a mathematical equation or a mathematical principle. And so it's not central to any, at least as far as I understand it, any theory that's built in a causal realist fashion.
Well,
Well,
I would
I
add
would
to
add
that.
to that.
Wait a minute, I'm
Wait a
hearing
minute,
an
I'm hearing
echo
an
on your
echo on
side,
your
Jeff.
side.
Can you
From me?
turn it down slightly?
Sure.
Or even if you had earbuds, that would eliminate it
I
altogether.
can do it if it's still bad. Is that okay?
Well, let's test it. Oh
Should I
no,
go? Is this better?
I think it's better. Yeah, I think it's better. Okay. Um, I was going to say that I've watched Bob Murphy interact with mainstream economists with some success
Right.
because he speaks and you do too. I
Yeah.
mean, you were obviously trained in a mainstream program too, but he just openly speaks their language.
Right.
So it helps. It makes
That's
him
true.
not look like a crank, and it also helps
Yeah.
to have fruitful conversations that
Yeah.
way. So it won't. It's not like it's going to be a waste of your time or anything. And I don't think that's
Yeah.
what Jose is suggesting.
No, that's an excellent point, Tom. It is a necessary form of communication with our colleagues in neoclassical economics.
Okay, let's see what else we have. Folks, you got to ask us questions, or I'm going to have to ask boring questions of Jeff. Right? That's the punishment. I'll ask boring questions. What's his favorite kind of pasta?
Yeah.
It won't even be about economics. Actually, you know what? While we're waiting for more questions, what was your PhD dissertation about? I don't think I ever asked you that.
Oh my, you talk about boring.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to come out
No,
like
this
that.
was my PhD dissertation was on the theory of money, and it was an attempt to disaggregate the demand side for money. And I don't mean this in a kind of Friedman sense where he has portfolio analysis disaggregated into different categories of why people hold money, but disaggregated by the holder. So I compiled data, firm level data, and then reconstructed market demand for money from firm level data, and then did some analysis of the relationship between that metric, that way of thinking about money, and standard kinds of macroeconomic variables, the interest rate, and so on. So it was highly econometric and quite boring.
Interesting. Is there anything that you would ever be able to or want to pull out of it that could have some value for Austrians?
Not really, except that it is it shows that it is possible to do some disaggregated macroeconomic analysis. So it isn't always necessary to use standard money metrics like M1 and so on. You can't the data is actually available if you're willing to dig for it to do at least firm level. It's household probably not, but at least firm level data. So there's some interesting things you can do with that data that you can't do with aggregated data.
Let me. I have four questions I see in front of me. I'm going to pick Kristen's question first. Even though she did not press the question button, I'll mark it as a question for her. She says, we know that preferences cannot be compared interpersonally, but neoclassical economics clearly seems to be okay with production functions, etc. So how do they, in their own minds/models, ignore the marginal/subjectivist revolution? All right. Well, first of all, not everybody's going to understand that question. Can you try to explain? First of all, what's a production function? And then secondly, yeah, I mean, just try your best to explain this to a lay audience.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we should start with the subjective side. So, um, no. Okay. I'll, I'll amend that. Let's start with the production side.
Oh,
That's probably better.
I was just checking
So,
to make sure that my lights were on full blast because I seem a little
yeah.
dark here. I
No,
wasn't
you look.
mocking you like, oh, Jeff, you'll never accomplish that. It wasn't that.
Yeah. Okay. So the production function is just the standard way in which neoclassical economists model the principles of the law of returns, diminishing returns, with respect to inputs and outputs. So they usually have a simple uh, arrangement where the production of output depends upon the amount of a capital input and a labor input. So it's usually a very simple three good model. And then they just invoke, and they think of capital and labor as divisible into homogeneous units, so there's no heterogeneity of or diversity of capital and labor inputs. And they do this in order to get at this basic point, which is that if you have inputs and you use them in combination, as you add more and more of a variable input to a fixed amount of another input, you'll get decreasing additions to output. And so that's how they think about the production relationship. In fact, neoclassical economists scale that to the entire economy, which I was talking about just a minute ago. They don't aggregate all the different production functions of different businesses into a macro production function. They just say the macro economy is just like the production function of an individual firm. And so they're thinking about this simplistic fashion of modeling a production relationship. So that's the production function. And then when they get to utility, they have this problem. Because what they want to do is model utility in the same way so that it is a kind of symmetric relationship. So that what they want to do is to say, let's have a utility function where we have a consumer who's consuming two goods, X and Y. Just like let's have a production function where a businessman is producing output with two inputs, K and L. And so they want diminishing marginal utility to be the companion principle to diminishing returns. And so they say, let's have a utility function, and if one consumer has a given amount of good X and they consume additional units of Y, the addition to their total utility diminishes as they consume more of this good. And this gives them nice functional relationships that are tractable and showing how consumers modeled this way, economic agents can maximize utility, or how businesses can maximize profit within these constraints of production functions. And the problem with this approach, of course, is that, or the difficulty that neoclassical economists had to grapple with, was output is an objective, measurable phenomena. So you're producing a certain number of cars or a certain number of ice cream cones or whatever it is. But as the question indicates, subjective value, the utility that a consumer gets from consumption, is not manifest in on objective units of something. It's subjective. There are no units. They're just the value in the mind of the consumer. And so, in order to move forward with the notion of a utility function, the neoclassical economists give up working with a model that has a real human person or a set of real human persons in it. This is where they come up with the necessity of assuming that we have economic agents who do in fact have utility that we can track in this way, and then we give them different bundles of goods to consume, and we can sort of have proxy numbers for their utility and so on. And so we can have what they call representation functions that have quantitative proxy numbers for the amount of utility that this economic agent is getting from consuming various bundles. And they do all of this because they want to be able to have an analysis, a simple, sort of straightforward mathematical way of showing that a consumer, this economic agent, maximizes utility in erecting or compiling a consumption bundle of goods. And of course, the problem then becomes, how do you apply this kind of abstract model to real human persons in the world, you and me, who are actually buying things in the world and subjectively, as an actual human person, subjectively valuing things? This becomes the great. They can overcome one difficulty, but it just raises another difficulty, which is, how do you usefully apply this model?
I want to. Now we got a bunch of these, so let's see. I'll get to every. I think we'll certainly get to everybody who's on here. So don't worry that I'm skipping. But just quickly, this one: do you consider training in formal logic helpful for economics? I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, I don't either. David Gordon, interestingly, is kind of shifted. Maybe it's not right to say shifted positions, but his emphasis is now different than it used to be. When he wrote his book, it's kind of introductory book to economics.
Yeah, introductory by David Gordon.
Yeah, right, of course. So advanced for the rest, for real human beings, it was advanced. But anyway, he starts out with a chapter on logic, just on syllogistic logic, and then recently, though, when asked to lecture about praxeology and the logic of economics, he points out that the real logic of economics is more like just kind of common sense verbal logic. It isn't like a strict demonstrable symbolic kind of step-by-step procedure. So I don't think it is necessary, really. I mean, it's not harmful. It's certainly helpful to be able to follow logical arguments. I tell prospective students at Grove City College that are in high school who ask me about this question, what should I study to prepare to come to Grove City and learn economics? Well, aside from reading the great works in economics, if they haven't done that, I tell them the best thing they can do is take a good course in geometry, because the structure of reasoning is similar, although geometry is very formal and so on, and economic reasoning not so formal. So
that was about what I thought. Now this one, I will get to Jorge in a minute. In a recent debate with a friend, he argued that charity that charity can distort markets just as much as government interference. My question would be, can charity distort the economy as the same way as government interference? And I guess my initial response to that is that when we're looking at the economy, we're just looking at um, a, I mean, I believe Rothbard defined the free market as the nexus of voluntary interactions. Since charity is a voluntary interaction, it's not something apart from markets. It's another exchange, and so really what we're looking at is I mean, it's now with a it's not quite an exchange, I suppose, because if I'm just giving you something, it's not the same thing as if I give you something and you give me a dozen eggs, but still it takes place within a regime of private property, and so we wouldn't think of it. I mean, the idea of distortion is that resources are moved around in a way that they wouldn't have been moved around if people had been free to choose where those resources went. So if the government subsidizes something, that moves resources into particular sectors where they wouldn't have gone otherwise. But if somebody, through his own philanthropy, gives resources to some other people and those people use those resources, that's not a distortion. That is a reflection of our voluntary preferences. Distortion is the idea that our voluntary preferences are being overridden, and the overriding of these preferences has these particular manifestations. So I would say that charity is part of the market, and so the question, it's not even. I reject the premise of the question.
Yeah, I would also just add, there's another way to think about this. And I entirely agree with what Tom said, and that's to think about it in terms of Ludwig von Mises's conception of economic calculation. So there we see too that whether it's a customer buying a product from a company that's generating revenue, and then the entrepreneur, tries to make sure that the revenue stream from the customers covers costs, and so has every monetary incentive to keep costs down and be efficient and to appeal to the customers. The entrepreneur that runs a charitable organization obtains a revenue stream from voluntary donations from the donors. And so the economic calculation is very similar. The charitable organization has to provide a service, not directly to the donor, but a service to the third party, the recipient of the charity, that the donor supports monetarily, that the donor prefers and expresses through this demand for the activity of the charity. And that generates revenue, and then of course the charity wants to do as much good as possible. They'll keep their costs down, and so they're integrated just the way a for-profit company is into economic calculation. And so there's no sense in which we could say this is a distortion, as Tom was saying, or an inefficient or non-economizing allocation of resources. But when the state takes the funds from taxation and then spends them on some government project, this takes the resources out of the realm of economic calculation, and therefore their use is always inefficient.
Okay, now let's go to Jorge's question. He says, what is the difference between ATMS and more commonly used measures? ATMS is decelerating quickly, while the other measures seem to be still growing. The difference in growth rates mean different outlooks for the economy.
Oh,
Does he mean the Austrian true money supply?
yeah, so that, well, I would assume that's what he means. But it's a question what constitutes the items in the true money supply that differ from the mainstream?
Maybe.
Is that his question, or is his question just why is there a diversity of movement? Or
well, it could be both, and maybe,
yeah, I guess right, sure.
Maybe answering the first one answers the second one.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the measure. How it differs.
We should explain to people. This is a way of. There are different ways of looking at the money supply, and Austrians basically it's like a Rothbard Salerno project, more or less,
Right.
isn't it?
That's
Develop
exactly right.
something they call the true money supply.
That's right.
That we use. And in the charts that you can find at Mises.org, one of those that you can look at is the true money supply.
That's
in
right.
the Austrian understanding. All right, now I'm sorry. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. So what Rothbard and Salerno are trying to get at with the true money supply is they're trying to find all of the actual financial instruments in our economy that satisfy the conceptual definition of what should be considered the general medium of exchange. And so obviously money would be part of it, money proper, I mean. So the Federal Reserve notes, the currency, would be included in the true money supply, just like it would be in the standard statistics of M1 and MZM and M2 and so on and so forth. And then checking account balances, all checkable deposits would be included since they're money substitutes. So all money proper and money substitutes are included in a accurate metric for measuring the money stock. The tricky part is what exactly constitutes a money substitute, and Mises here again leads the way in giving the definition. He says a money substitute is a claim to money that's exercisable on demand at par. It's an instantaneously convertible claim to money. And so everything that's like that, like a checking account balance, you can cash out an ATM machine anytime you want, well, anytime the bank is open. At par value with your checking account balance. You have $100 in your account, you can cash out $100 in cash. But there's all sorts of other things that are also in practice redeemed on demand at par, like passbook saving accounts are redeemed on demand at par by banks. And if they are, then they're part of the money stock and not part of the credit market, even though they are a loan activity. The bank will take the funds and lend them out. But from the customer's viewpoint, from the money demander's viewpoint, they are readily spendable funds because the banks will, in fact, redeem the funds out of your passbook saving account on demand at par. And so those are included in the true money supply. And not, and sometimes overlooked in the other metrics. The different metrics vary as to what they count and what they don't count. So M1 does not include passbook saving accounts. M2 minus large time deposits does include them. And so you kind of, to compare these different metrics, you have to look at the actual list and see. And then there's some things that are perhaps more controversial. They're in the true money supply that have to do with non-bank redemption claims, like money market mutual funds. So share accounts that are actually invested but are redeemable to the holder on demand at par and cash. If they're instruments like that, they're included in the true money supply. And again, maybe not in, say, in MZM or one of the standard metrics. So it's possible then that that something is happening to the items that are in the government official metrics. They're stable or rising, where these items that are included in the true money supply are decreasing. I haven't actually looked at that data set for a while, so I'm not familiar in detail with what's making. Did the question say the true money supply was falling?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what component is pushing it down. You could find this out though just by decomposing the true money supply and then looking independently at that particular component, looking independently at the components. So I can tell you right up front, the items that are increasing in the true money supply and increasing in all the other metrics are currency. Currency is steadily going up. It's now over $1.7 trillion of actual physical currency. And checkable deposits have also been steadily increasing. So I know those two components are continuously increasing and didn't experience any decrease when you add them together. There was no decrease throughout the downturn even. So again, I'm not sure which component it is of the true money supply that's fallen. That's a good question, and it wouldn't be that hard to find out.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to jump around a bit, just up and down in the questions. Let's do this one. A basic question for my teenage daughter. Many years ago, my macroeconomics professor told the class that monetary inflation is justified because it's a zero-sum game. What did he mean, and can you address the pragmatic and ethical implications? Now, I can't know what he meant, but I assume that what he means is that nobody really loses with inflation because even though the price of goods might go up, your wages also go up, so it's a wash. But the key point here would be if it is a wash, then why are they doing it? If it
Yeah,
really has no effect, then
right.
they would just not do it.
Yeah,
The second thing would be, of course, the distribution effects, because
right.
some people will be benefited because they're closer to the source of the initial money and other people are not. There's that.
Mm.
There's the fact that if you have savings in nominal dollars, which is how we have all our savings, the inflation does hurt you. It may not. It may be true that maybe in your case, suddenly prices start going up for the things you buy, and your salary goes up exactly that amount simultaneously. That does not deal with the problem of your savings. Your savings, the value of that savings is going to be diminished by the inflation. So that is certainly not a zero sum game. So that's another problem with it. And then further, given the form inflation takes in our economy now, well, it leads to the way the inflation comes about leads to the business cycle, and that damages a lot of people's lives. That's a moral problem. So this is not a zero sum game. Would be the way I'd look at it.
Right, and we could even add another element, although it's just an extension of what you said. Uh, Monetary inflation always makes it more difficult for entrepreneurs to engage in normal economic calculation, precisely because of these distribution effects, or the Cantillon effects, as they're called. It becomes much more difficult for them to predict exactly which prices are going to go up relative to other prices, and therefore to calculate the profit. When they earn a profit, they're not really sure. Even like in the 1920s, when the overall purchasing power of money stayed the same, whether that means a real gain to them, even if their profit is higher, because now they have to go back into the market and buy their inputs. And their input prices may have been boosted, even though other prices are falling or not going up so fast. So every entrepreneur is less able, because of this churning of prices, to make accurate forecasts of the future. And so we lose the productivity of economic efficiency of the calculations of entrepreneurs when we have monetary and price inflation.
Yeah, there's that too. So, yeah. So go find that professor.
That's right.
Scold that person.
Yeah, get on Facebook.
All right, I'm going to jump around a little bit more. Um, yeah, now this one, I think I've been told that Jeff actually has a very, very out there, hardcore answer to this, and I'm almost afraid to hear it. To be honest with you, you ready?
Okay.
All right, this one. I'm not kidding. By the way, I've
All
heard
right.
this that you have
All
a
right.
very, very, very hardcore answer,
We're
and
about to find out.
yeah. Okay, here we go. But it's so funny that I am building suspense
Yeah.
about such a nerdy topic. All right,
Only
here
you
it
could do this, Tom.
is. Wait till you hear the question. I just love that I'm so excited about this question. Okay, so John asks, can you please discuss when statistical data is useful, looking at history, and when it is problematic, econometrics? Is there a bright line you can specify? So that is to say, somebody like Rothbard writes America's Great Depression. He's using a lot of statistics from history to tell his story. But he's saying that when economists are doing econometrics, then this is a misuse of statistics. So try to help me understand when it's okay to use statistics is the question.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think
All
the answer
right.
is going to be a letdown, Tom, but here we
Oh,
go.
is
I
it?
don't know. The answer is what it is, right? So my view on this is as follows. Um, I think Mises has an excellent unanswerable, so far I've never heard an answer to this, an excellent and so far unanswered argument against the use of mathematics in in dealing with the actual data of human action. And the argument is there are no constants in the relationship between different measurable data sets in human action. So for example, how an increase in the price of gasoline affects the quantity purchased by consumers. There's no constant relationship between, say, an increase in the price of 5% and a necessary response of an increase in 2% quantity purchase that you could trace over time with an emerging data set, or that you could even do with cross-sectional data across time. You can't just assume that that there's this constancy. And so when you formulate, though, an an econometric equation, it has variables and constants. Well, if it has constants in it, then it's specifying the actual way in which the data is related. One data set's related to another data set through time. And so if somebody can show me that that argument's wrong, well, then I guess I would accept. I would be in a better position in my own mind to accept econometric results. But if they're all based on some assumption that there's a constant, even in past data, this is not true. And so that's my difficulty in accepting econometrics as a useful device.
Okay, how do we distinguish that from economic history? Why is economic history okay? Is it a different kind of method we use?
We can do. I mean, again, you pointed this out with Rothbard's America's Great Depression. He doesn't run regressions. He he deals with the data. He deals with all the data, but he does this with human judgment, and so this seems to be the proper way to proceed. Now, does this, would I be against every book written in economic history that did, simple correlations of data sets? Well, maybe not. Maybe that's sort of okayish, but it's certainly not scientific. It's certainly not like a method of doing economic history in my judgment. I think that the historian has to make a best assessment of the relevance of each of the causal factors and how the data has been generated by the intertwining of all those different causal factors, and that econometrics is of little use in this. It's I don't see why it would be on a theoretical level. I don't see why it would be a mainstay of doing economic history.
Okay, now let's jump back down again for a minute. Are there any measurements of inflation that avoid the problems of using an arbitrary basket of goods like CPI? So again, just to make sure people understand that there's no, and I think Mises even says this, there's no way to measure the so-called price level. Because what you can do is observe movements in prices of particular things, but there's no level. So it depends on, depending on the particular things you choose, you're going to get a particular result. But you shouldn't delude yourself into thinking that you've thereby identified something called the price level. Now, I think most economists would hear that and think that's just unnecessarily pedantic and nitpicking. So first of all, what's the defense of Mises against that riposte? And secondly, to the person's question, is there some way that you can do this that doesn't fall into this problem?
Right. So let's start. Let me address the one question. What Mises is always focusing on when he talks about this question of estimating, having a market basket, so to speak, and estimating the overall increase in the prices of a market basket, he's always talking about human action. He talks about the housewife, for example, and he says a housewife knows more about the purchasing power of her own funds as she spends them at the grocery store than any bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. Because what's relevant for human action is not the overall prices of things in throughout the whole economy, because no one acts with respect to things throughout the whole economy. We're only acting within the sphere of goods under our command, whether entrepreneurs or consumers and so on. And so that's what's relevant. That's actually what's relevant for human action. And so that's what we should focus on. Now, one might say, well, and so that's where Mises's view comes from, right? That's why he takes this particular position and not another. And then one might say to this, well, but what about the economists? What about the scientists? Can't the scientists come up with a single objective way of calculating the price level, as Tom put it? Can't we decide what among ourselves as scientists, where we're not interested in human action? We're not interested in acting with respect to these prices. We just want a data set to work with. And Mises says the problem here is that there simply isn't any objective way to decide between the competing claims that would be made by different groups who want to do scientific analysis. So, for example, one might say, well, I think the best metric to use is the consumer price index, and then they would make some argument for that. And then another group of scientists would say, another group of economists would say, no, the best price index to use is the wholesale price index. And they would say, and this is the reason, blah, 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 blah. And then another economist group would say, no, we should use the GDP price deflator that includes all the goods across the economy, or we should use Google's billion prices or whatever, and track that because that includes more goods than other metrics. And as Mises pointed out, the problem with all this is there isn't any argument, knockdown argument that one could make to show that one of these groups is right and another is wrong. And so, as he points out, we're sort of stuck with when we're doing history, we're just kind of stuck with making a judgment as to what we think is the best way to have a sense of what's happening to the overall purchasing power of money, and using a metric that we think is appropriate. When I was doing the earlier parts of American economic history, well, we don't have the modern government bureaus giving us a data set that runs back into the colonial period. And so you have to work with the data that's available. And, this is, so is that wrong? Well, and it's, in a sense, that's the best we can do scientifically, or seemingly, right, without being maybe an expert in the field where we could maybe get original documents and so on, where we could look more closely. But you see the problem. It's just, this is what Mises was focusing on.
All right. Now, I know you've addressed this in a talk you give at Mises University on competing theories of interest. However, you're going to have to deal with it here also. So somebody wants to know, somebody has heard the scandalous news or a scandalous rumor that Bob Murphy has a disagreement with the pure time preference theory of interest. So can you explain for us where his disagreement is, where it lies?
Yeah. So Bob's very, very open about this. He outlined this in his dissertation, and he's, in fact, I didn't do this, but somebody asked him recently if he had changed his mind about, now that this debate has run out a little bit further, if he's changed his mind. He said, no, I'm sticking with what I said before. And do you know about this, Tom?
Well, no, but I want to jump in that because that reminds me, because you said the word debate.
Okay. You want to jump in now, or should I?
Let me say this first before you give your explanation. There was a thread in my private group. I have a private group for people who are at supportinglisteners.com, and somebody said, maybe as a bonus episode just for the nerds, could we have a debate episode between Herbner and Murphy on the pure time preference theory of interest? And I said, and so my response, they actually didn't use the word nerds. I did. My response was simply the word nerds.
Yeah, that's exactly
that was all
right.
I said. That was my answer, nerds. But I don't know. You know what? It reminds me a little bit of Bill Buckley writing in National Review about the disappearance of the Latin Mass. And he was hearing people say, oh, the Latin Mass is just for, the intellectuals, which, by the way, is not true. But for the sake of argument, we'll say it is. Buckley said, well, the intellectuals are people, too. Right? Can't we have a Mass? And so likewise, nerds are people, too. Can't they have a debate? So in principle, is this something that you would do?
Oh, my goodness.
I'm putting you on the spot, Jeff. It's not therapy.
Yeah.
It's not therapy.
Actually, what I am, I'll say this, what I am working on a written piece, sort of trying to address all of the dissenters from the time preference theory of interest. So I am working on this, and I hope to have it in print. So I wouldn't commit to a debate, but I'm committing to being part of the sort of quiet debate.
Okay, all right.
The nonverbal debate.
Okay, all right.
But I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't say no, on the face of it.
Okay,
to
yeah,
talk,
sure,
to,
sure.
to debate with Bob about it. That'd be
And
fun.
it would be, like the world's friendliest. Because
Oh yeah, of course, of
did
course.
you know Bob and I are doing a debate on the Contra Cruise
I've
Zone?
heard I've heard this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. See,
yeah,
that's going to be a vicious
yeah.
knockdown, drag out. I mean,
Right.
that's going to be horrible. But you and Bob debating time prep, that's going to be no problem
Yeah,
if that happens.
that's right.
All right, so
Because
go ahead and explain what is the pure time preference theory of interest, and then where does, not that I want to prejudice people in the way they look at this, but let's just say, where does Bob's deviation come in?
yeah, and of course, if Bob and I did debate, there'd be nothing at stake because I don't have a beard.
Oh, that's true. You'd have
So,
to shave
so
it off.
yeah, like
Maybe in your case, you'd have to grow a
I could,
beard.
I could grow a beard and shave it off. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I lose. Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So anyway, the time preference theory of interest is just an extension of the subjective value revolution of the marginalist revolution. And so you remember the context where the British Classical School had argued that prices of goods are determined by cost of production. And then this was overturned by the marginalist revolution, showing that prices of consumer goods or output are determined by preferences, by utility, subjective utility. And then Mises extended that to money, and so made a great extension of subjective value theory, showing that the purchasing power of money is just the price of money in the market, and this too is determined just by our preferences to hold money, and then the stock of money that exists. And so it's not an exception. The neoclassical economists, of course, don't accept that. And so the neoclassical economists also don't accept the time preference theory of interest. They hold to the view that interest is the physical return on capital, or at least the value return on capital, the value productivity of capital. So that's the kind of standard view. And the pure time preference theory of interest then was developed, extended by Frank Federer, really, um, probably the original formulation of the pure time preference theory. And he said, no, this, if we're going to be serious about subjective value theory, we have to extend it then to the trade between present money and future money. That too must be based just upon our preferences for present money versus future money. And so here he points out the necessity of time preference. The time preference is just in the nature of temporal beings, that for a given satisfaction to be obtained either sooner or later, we prefer a given satisfaction sooner. And this is the way that Federer formulated the time preference theory. The problem with this formulation, or the difficulty that's involved in this formulation, and this is what Bob Murphy picks up on, is that you define time preference as a preference, a satisfaction comparison, but how then does it manifest itself in the exchange of goods? So that becomes the secondary problem, right? We can see this for apples, how we trade apples for money, and then the price of apples emerges. But what are we trading in the present versus the future? What are we giving up in the present to get in the future? In terms of the actual physical things being traded, for which interest is the price. So it's the intertemporal price of what, given that we have time preferences as satisfaction. And so the problem is that aside from Federer, even Federer was a little bit ambiguous on this. It became more standard by the holders of the pure time preference theory of interest, like Mises and Rothbard, to say one of two things. Either time preference interest rate is manifest as the premium of present goods over future goods, or the discount of future goods relative to present goods. Or sometimes they would put it in the more Fedetarian way, where they would say, no, the interest rate is the premium of present money over future money. And so that was the preferred way that Federer put it. And that's the correct way in which to express it. So Bob picks up on this ambiguity, and he says, well, wait a minute, look, if you say that the interest rate is the premium of present goods over future goods, you have a problem, because present goods don't in fact trade always at a premium for future goods of like kind. They don't, right? That's why we have forward markets, futures trade. So we could take a given good, right, and it could have a higher price in the future than it does in the present. And it doesn't. Bob's absolutely right about this. And so he says, look, if that's what you mean, then by a premium, well, then time preference doesn't always generate a premium of present goods over future goods. You don't always see this in the market, and so obviously there's something wrong with the theory. And then he says, if you just define time preference as a satisfaction, then you don't have any application to the real world. So those are his basic criticisms against the pure time preference theory, at least that he advanced originally in his dissertation. And my response to this is already in print. So I've responded to this by saying the correct way to formulate the pure time preference theory is always that people are trading present money for future money. When people trade present money for future money, there's always a premium of present money over future money in market exchange. And that premium is always founded on time preference. It has other components, causes, but the fundamental cause is time preference. Notice there isn't any forward transaction for money. So nobody says, two parties don't agree today, hey, in 6 months, I'll trade you $1 bill if you give me another dollar bill. Right? They don't, there's the spot price of money, but there's no future price of money. And so money doesn't contain this other element that other goods do that can have different forward prices at different moments in time. And therefore it can be, the interest premium can be purely manifest with money where not so with goods.
Bob is doing a series on his podcast.
I've been listening to those.
Oh, have you? Okay.
Yeah, I've listened to the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't
I
listened
think
to
he's gonna have it ultimately be 3, and I just love
Right.
that he looks at his audience as being a group of people who would at least consider listening to 3 episodes on interest theory.
It's incredible, and the first goes for an hour, and it's just filled with econ nerd stuff. It's great.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. Come on, 3 of those?
That's
incredible.
Especially
incredible.
when it's still a relatively new podcast. That is a bold move. Bold.
You're absolutely right. But he's pretty passionate about this. This is his dissertation. This is a big deal for him.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple more that I see here. Oh, geez. Well, geez, boy, that one's really technical. I typed in answers to one of them, to Ben's question. Let's do. All right, let's do it. It's technical, but just somehow I need you to guide us through it. I do not understand the IMF basket of currencies, the IMF's SDR, I guess special drawing rights, parentheses, and how it is funded, and the intention and role of the SDR. I wouldn't want to ask anyone that question.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
It's been asked.
Yeah. We can take a shot at this. So you have to remember, it's all traceable back to the history of the IMF. So the IMF started up after the war, part of the Bretton Woods system, the international part of the Bretton Woods system after World War II. And it was designed to stabilize international exchange markets. And then there was the World Bank, the companion institution that was designed to allocate funding, to allocate capital funding, outside the market, have a government direction of some capital funding at least. Now their functions have sort of drifted over time, but it's important when we talk about the special drawing rights. It's kind of important to have that history in mind. So under Bretton Woods, of course, initially the system was that the dollar would be still redeemable internationally for gold, and then all the other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and so all the other central banks of the world would hold dollar reserves, and then if there were international redemption claims for their currency, they would fulfill them in dollars and not in gold, and then the U.S. would always agree to redeem in gold for foreign central bank attempts to redeem dollars at the Treasury Department, so in the U.S. And well, so they found out pretty quickly when the system got started, right? They found out pretty quickly that there's insufficient the distribution of the allocation of reserves of currencies across the different countries is inadequate, and it's not distributed in a way that makes it smoothly functioning for these redemption claims to be done and new pegs to be set and so on and so forth. So the IMF came up with this scheme of the special drawing right as kind of a substitute redemption currency. And as the questioner points out, this was supposed to be a basket of currencies, and so currencies that had more reserve status could be put into the SDR without jeopardizing their status as reserve, and those that were more scarce as reserve could not be so prominent in the basket. And then the special drawing rights were kind of like a securitized claim on the basket, right? So the IMF, the special drawing right was redeemable against the IMF for a representative basket of the currencies the IMF would hold. And so it's kind of like mortgage-backed securities. It's the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac issued the security, and then it's their responsibility and not the underlying mortgages. And this allowed the IMF then to distribute reserve positions to countries where there were more pressure for devaluation of their currency, more redemption claims, and so on, without having to acquire gold or dollars or other reserve balances that have been more difficult to acquire.
There's a question from early on that I want to jump all the way back to. And the question says, what was the effect of inflation before the Fed? In discussing inflation and the Fed with folks, how can I connect the dots between the Fed and inflation? All right, I think those are two different questions. So what was the effect of inflation before the Fed? I don't know. Well, I'm going to let you take apart what you take that to mean.
Well, maybe it'd be easier to answer them in reverse order.
Okay.
So just for context, right? So before the Fed, if the question is talking about price inflation, before the Fed, the purchasing power of the dollar went up and down in the 19th century. But if you look at the purchasing power at the beginning of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, it was roughly the same. So there were periods of modest price inflation during the 19th century, and then periods of modest price deflation. And on balance, it came out pretty similar. If you take the 100 or so years since the Fed, 1913 to the present, the dollar's lost something like 96 or 97% of its purchasing power. So it's been pretty steadily downward. Again, there were a few episodes of price deflation, notably the first 3 years of the Great Depression, the 1920 downturn. But the trend has definitely been inflationary with respect both to money and prices. Now, if we go back to the first part of the question, that question, I think, correct me, Tom, if I'm wrong, so I don't go off down a rabbit hole, but wasn't that question about monetary inflation and not price inflation?
Well, it's not.
The first part? It's not specified.
Yeah, it doesn't specify.
Okay, so let's start with monetary inflation. So in the 19th century, monetary inflation was not a process that was centralized, or was only partially centralized, to put it that way. So there wasn't the kind of central bank cartelization of the banking system that provided for in concert expansion of the money stock and then bailout protection to banks that were excessively profligate, like we have in the 20th century under the Fed. And so the process of monetary inflation was, again, more arrested. It would go in fits and starts. So the banks would expand, and then they'd overextend, and they'd start to lose specie with redemption. And since there was no central bank to bail them out, they would go through periodic panics and bank failures, and then they would retrench and there'd be a period of boom and bust, um, uh, episodes of boom and bust. But generally, they're with commodity money as the base money, and a non fully cartelized banking system that is more competition among the various banks. There was much less possibility of continuous monetary inflation, and so again, what we had in the 19th century was really relative price stability, up and down movements in various episodes. Of course, the Civil War, we had a gigantic monetary and price inflation. But after that, mild price deflation during the latter part of the 19th century, and some up and down in the early part of the 19th century. So we had a more stable system than in the 20th century. I remember, Tom, another point on this. You probably know this better than me, and you might rehearse this. You had a guest on a podcast who talked about the bank panics. Uh, Calamiris,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. A long
Calamaris.
time ago. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And he was an expert in bank uh, crises, right?
Right.
And yeah, so he has some. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but he chronicles this. He said, look, there are only whatever a dozen bank crises in the 19th century, and there were 100 in the last
Yeah.
40 years or something. I don't. Is that
Yeah.
approximately right? Or
In fact, what I'll do is I just used that raw information for an episode of the Tom Woods Show.
oh
That I'll
oh
link to it.
yeah.
Episode 1392. So let me type that into the chat. It's very much worth listening to because it's if you have this information at your fingertips, you're just going to
Yeah,
kill anybody,
it's
because
fantastic.
well, surely we need to have, deposit insurance or something. And what he was saying is that the the scholarly consensus, he says, now, big deal. Nobody knows about the scholarly consensus except the scholars, but the
Yeah,
scholarly consensus is that the problems we've had with banking instability in the past half century have come from giving guarantees to banks.
yeah,
And and then I said to him, all right, but and as I said, yeah, right, he's got statistics like you would not believe. But then I said to him, all right, but how do you answer just the average Joe who just wants to make sure his money is safe and he's not going to lose all his money in the bank? And his answer to that was, if you have deposit insurance, well, it's not like that money just comes out of nowhere. I mean, yeah, you get the money that was in your right pocket that you put in the bank, you get that returned to you from your left pocket. They take that out of you as a taxpayer, and
yeah,
so on balance, as a taxpayer, you wind up getting hit harder. So on net, it's a loss for you. It's he says the jury is in on this, and that's basically the answer. So but what he also but his thing was he went through and as you say talked about the number of bank crises, and by which he was measuring that by the percentage of GDP involved in depositor losses.
hmm
And he was saying that it's some trivial figure. I mean, the biggest one in the U.S. in the 19th century was 1893, where it was 0.1% of GDP. Where he says we've had in excess of 1 to 2%, sometimes way more than that,
yeah,
many times. And I don't remember the exact number in the age in which we supposedly solved all these problems.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, worth listening
It's a
to.
wonderful podcast, and this research is I've dipped my toe in some of this research. I mean, it's all as he says, it's all just standard NBER papers and mainstream journals. It's all just standard stuff. It's quite remarkable.
Right. So it's not just our stuff and our
Right.
friends. It's just what everybody is saying.
Yeah.
Now the conclusions you draw from that you have to see, but uh, to him it was pretty obvious. That was episode when I had him on. That was episode because that would also be worth listening to. Not just my crummy summary, but the actual episode itself. That was, I think, let's see, 213. So if you really want to hear the full conversation, and the episode is called "What Causes Banking Crises." Now he's not an Austrian, so you'd have
Right.
some nits to pick, but if he understands the problems caused by deposit insurance and thinks it should be abolished, then I'd say he's
Yeah,
a fellow traveler. Let's put it
yeah,
that way.
absolutely.
So I'll put the link to that if you want to hear the original. Uh, and plus, you'll hear a younger Tom Woods, a more timid interviewer than the fearless crusader he's become today.
The
Uh,
bearded crusader.
that's right. That's right. Now, I believe that is. I think that's it, because we are now at 9 p.m. Eastern. I think there was only one question that we missed, and I'm sorry we didn't get to it. But we do have the forums you can use and get your questions answered. Let me close by asking Jeff a question. This coming summer, is this when you will have for us the second half of your course on American economic
Well,
history?
well, let me put it this way: I will be working feverishly on the second half. I'm making progress. I won't promise that it'll be done by the end of summer, but I hope to have it as soon as possible. And
Okay.
I'm having great fun, and it should be a nice companion to part one.
Oh, sure, sure, sure. And plus, this is the stuff that a lot of people are going to want to skip ahead to.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, well,
it's
that's true.
we're
That's true.
familiar with, right?
Yeah, I should have done them in reverse order, I
Yeah, but you know what? But no, I think this way. I don't. I think you should be disciplined enough not to skip ahead. You should
guess.
force them to eat
Right.
their vegetables first. You got to learn
Yeah.
about the 19th century panics before
Yeah.
we'll let you go on to the Great Depression and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. That's what
all
makes
right.
us nerds, Tom.
Yeah, I know this whole thing is just an embarrassment. If well, like let's say if the 13-year-olds I went to junior high with, if we were all 13 and they were listening to this is what I was going to turn out to be, they'd all say, "Yeah, we pretty much saw that coming."
Yeah.
That is the guy Woods was destined to be. All right, thank you very much for being here, and thanks to all you good folks for being here live with us. And hope you enjoy this, got something out of it. Next month, I got to figure out who our special guest will be. Well, in fact, it may be Murphy because I was going to have Murphy on, and he could
Hmm.
have done it later in the week, but I said no. April is ending. I got to have the April thing done. So for May, it'll probably be Murphy, and maybe we can. I mean, but you know what? Don't ask him about interest rate when he comes on. Let's talk about something else. All right. Good night, everybody. Good night, Jeff. Thank you very much.